The emergence of the Nachtigall and Roland battalions in 1941 cannot be understood without placing them within the broader geopolitical and national context of Eastern Europe on the eve of Operation Barbarossa. The interwar years had left Ukraine divided, its western regions falling under Polish administration after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, while its central and eastern lands became part of the Soviet Union. Ukrainian nationalist movements, fractured in the 1920s, had by the late 1930s consolidated around the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN. This movement itself was split between two factions, OUN-M, led by Andriy Melnik, advocating gradual and diplomatic approaches, and OUN-B under Stepan Bandera, supporting direct action and revolutionary struggle. Both factions shared the ultimate aim of establishing an independent Ukrainian state, but they differed sharply in methods and relations with external powers. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 radically changed the strategic environment. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Germany invaded Poland from the west, while the Soviet Union entered from the east. As a result, Western Ukraine, previously under Polish control, was annexed by the USSR. This brought millions of Ukrainians under Soviet rule, with rapid collectivization, political purges, and suppression of nationalist organizations following. Thousands of Ukrainian activists were arrested, deported, or executed in 1939-1940, which deepened hostility toward Soviet power. At the same time, nationalist circles recognized the potential of aligning with Germany, at least temporarily, in the hope that the Wehrmacht's advance could create conditions for proclaiming Ukrainian independence. The German Abwehr, led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, saw potential in exploiting anti-Soviet sentiment among Ukrainians. Even before the formal planning of Operation Barbarossa, German intelligence cultivated links with OUN activists, who had networks across Galicia and Volhynia. The Abwehr's special unit, Brandenburg 800, responsible for sabotage and infiltration, sought auxiliary forces that could operate behind Soviet lines. It was in this framework that the concept of forming Ukrainian battalions took shape. In late 1940 and early 1941, negotiations between OUN representatives and German military intelligence led to the creation of two units, Nachtigall, meaning nightingale, and Roland. These would not be formally incorporated into the Wehrmacht, but would serve under Abwehr command as auxiliary detachments. The Nachtigall battalion was formed primarily from OUN-B members, with training and equipping provided in Germany, specifically at the Neuhammer training camp in Silesia. Command was entrusted to Roman Shukevich, a prominent OUN activist who later became commander of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA. German liaison officers were appointed to supervise operations, among them Theodor Oberländer, who would later become a controversial political figure in West Germany. Recruitment focused on young, politically reliable nationalists who could be trusted to carry out operations in support of the Wehrmacht's eastward advance. Parallel to this, the Roland Battalion was organized in Romania, drawing recruits from OUN-M circles and Ukrainian émigrés. It was placed under the command of Yevhen Pobihushchai, a Ukrainian officer with prior service in the Polish army. The Roland unit was smaller in size than Nachtigall, but was similarly intended for special operations, including reconnaissance, sabotage, and propaganda work in territories expected to fall under German control. Both battalions were structured as auxiliary companies within the Abwehr framework, not exceeding several hundred men each. The geopolitical calculations behind their creation were complex. For Germany, these units offered a potential tool to destabilize Soviet rear areas, provide intelligence, and secure communications during the rapid advance. They also symbolized Berlin's willingness to exploit nationalist aspirations without granting political recognition. For the Ukrainian nationalists, cooperation with the Germans was seen as a tactical step, not a strategic alliance. Leaders such as Bandera and Shukevich believed that once the Soviets were defeated, they could declare Ukrainian independence, even if this ran counter to German objectives. Thus, from the very outset, the relationship was marked by divergent interests and mutual suspicion. The formation of Nachtigall and Roland coincided with the final months of preparation for Operation Barbarossa. By spring 1941, the Wehrmacht had concentrated more than 3 million men along the Soviet frontier, supported by over 3,500 tanks and 2,700 aircraft. Against this, the Red Army deployed nearly 2.7 million troops in western districts, but many units were understrength, poorly trained, and inadequately supplied. The Ukrainians within the Abwehr battalions were a small fraction of this enormous mobilization, numbering fewer than 1,000 in total, yet their political significance was out of proportion to their size. They represented both the possibility of nationalist collaboration and the seeds of future conflict over independence. As the countdown to the German invasion entered its final weeks, Nachtigall and Roland completed their training and awaited deployment. Their mission would begin on June 22, 1941, alongside the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa. For the men who had joined, the campaign promised both danger and opportunity: to fight against Soviet power, but also to test whether Germany would tolerate Ukrainian statehood. The answer to that question would shape not only their immediate operations, but also the trajectory of the Ukrainian nationalist movement during the war. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, opening the largest front of the Second World War. At dawn, German forces crossed the borders from the Baltic to the Black Sea, supported by massive artillery barrages and airstrikes. In the southern sector, Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, advanced into Soviet Ukraine with over 1.2 million men, 1,200 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. Opposing them, the Red Army's southwestern front, under General Mikhail Kirponos, deployed nearly 900,000 men, but many formations were underprepared and taken by surprise. Within this vast offensive, the Nachtigall and Roland battalions were activated as special units under Abwehr command. The Nachtigall battalion, numbering around 330 men, was attached to the German 1st Mountain Division of General Ludwig Kubler's 3rd Army Corps. It was moved into position near the Carpathian frontier, where it was tasked with advancing into Galicia alongside regular Wehrmacht units. The battalion wore German field uniforms with distinctive Ukrainian insignia added, symbolizing its hybrid status. German officers supervised operational matters, but Ukrainian leaders such as Roman Shukhevich commanded the internal structure of the unit. For the Ukrainian recruits, this marked the moment when their training would be tested in real combat conditions. The Roland battalion, with approximately 350 men, was deployed differently. Stationed initially in Romania, it was attached to German units of Army Group South, moving northward through Bukovina and Bessarabia. Its role was envisioned as auxiliary, securing roads, conducting reconnaissance, and distributing propaganda in areas captured from the Soviets. Commanded by Yevhen Pobyhushchi, the battalion had close ties to OUN-M circles, which hoped to gain German recognition by demonstrating loyalty and effectiveness. Like Nachtigall, it was small in size compared to regular divisions, but expected to provide local expertise and intelligence support. In the first days of the invasion, Nachtigall advanced rapidly with German forces into western Ukraine. Soviet defenses in Galicia were overwhelmed by the surprise and scale of the attack. On June 30, 1941, the battalion entered Lviv together with the Wehrmacht. This entry carried both military and political significance. For the OUNB leadership, it created an opportunity to proclaim Ukrainian independence, which they did on the same day through Yaroslav Stetsko's Act of Renewal of Ukrainian Statehood. Although this act was not sanctioned by the Germans and was quickly rejected by Berlin, it demonstrated the political aspirations linked with the battalion's advance. The men of Nachtigall, moving through the city in German uniforms, symbolized for many the ambiguous position of Ukrainian nationalists, armed, organized, but dependent on German approval. The Roland battalion, meanwhile, was delayed in its deployment. Though intended for frontline operations, German commanders quickly reassigned it to rear area duties. In practice, this meant guarding communications, securing captured infrastructure, and assisting in spreading propaganda among local populations. Its activities were limited compared to Nachtigall, and many of its members expressed frustration at the restricted scope of their mission. This difference in operational roles between the two units would later influence their reputations and the way they were remembered in Ukrainian and German records. Civilian reactions to the entry of these battalions varied widely. In Lviv and other western Ukrainian cities, some locals greeted the units with hope, interpreting their presence as a sign that an independent Ukrainian force was emerging. Others, particularly those affected by German occupation policies and anti-Jewish violence that followed immediately in the wake of the invasion, associated these formations with repression. Within days of entering Lviv, pogroms erupted, directed at the Jewish population, triggered by both German propaganda and local militias. While German Einsatzgruppen orchestrated much of the violence, the presence of nationalist militias and the visibility of Ukrainian auxiliaries complicated perceptions. The Nachtigall battalion itself was later accused of involvement, though subsequent historical investigations found evidence of German orchestration and Einsatzgruppen responsibility, with the role of Nachtigall members remaining a matter of historical debate. Nevertheless, the timing of their entry into Lviv left a lasting association between their arrival and the outbreak of violence. Operationally, both battalions continued to move eastward with German units. Nachtigall advanced beyond Lviv toward Ternopil and Vinnytsia, conducting patrols and securing territory. Roland's activities remained more confined as the Abwehr debated its future utility. The contrast between their initial expectations and actual assignments reflected the larger strategic imbalance. While Ukrainian nationalists saw themselves as allies pursuing statehood, German authorities viewed them as temporary auxiliaries to be used and later dissolved. By July 1941, it became increasingly clear that the German High Command would not tolerate independent Ukrainian political initiatives. The act of renewal proclaimed in Lviv was condemned by Berlin, and Bandera and Stetsko were soon arrested by the Gestapo. For the men of Nachtigall and Roland, this political rejection created uncertainty. They continued to operate militarily under German supervision, but the promise of recognition for Ukrainian independence evaporated. The battalions thus entered the next phase of the campaign, not as the nucleus of a national army, but as expendable instruments of German intelligence, advancing deeper into Soviet territory under orders that did not align with their political goals. The strategic goals behind the formation and deployment of the Nachtigall and Roland battalions were shaped by the broader context of Operation Barbarossa and the contrasting ambitions of Germany and the Ukrainian nationalist movement. For the German Abwehr, these units were conceived as auxiliary tools to facilitate the Wehrmacht's rapid advance. Their role was not to act as independent combat formations, but to provide local knowledge, carry out reconnaissance, spread propaganda, and in some cases participate in sabotage. The Abwehr had already experimented with small foreign detachments in other campaigns, using ethnic minorities or exiles to undermine enemy morale and disrupt communications. The Ukrainian battalions represented a continuation of this doctrine, adapted to the vast Soviet theater. German planning documents in early 1941 outlined several objectives for Ukrainian auxiliaries. First, they were to act as guides and interpreters in territories unfamiliar to German soldiers. Second, they could serve as intermediaries between the occupiers and the local population, encouraging cooperation and undermining Soviet authority. Third, they could be deployed for special operations behind the front, exploiting their language and cultural familiarity. However, German leadership, particularly within the Wehrmacht and Nazi Party, never envisioned granting political autonomy to these forces. The official policy, set by Hitler and reinforced by the Reich Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories under Alfred Rosenberg, saw Ukraine primarily as a source of resources, food, and labor for the German war economy. The idea of an independent Ukrainian state was categorically rejected. From the perspective of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, however, the creation of the battalions represented a tactical opening. The OUNB faction led by Bandera viewed the collaboration as a temporary alliance that could be used to achieve long-term goals. Roman Shukhevich, commanding Nachtigall, and Yevhen Pobyhushchi, leading Roland, both understood that the Abwehr saw them merely as auxiliaries, but they hoped that proving themselves in battle would strengthen the nationalist position. The declaration of Ukrainian independence in Lviv on June 30, 1941, was the clearest sign of this strategy, to use the moment of German advance to assert political sovereignty. The failure of Berlin to recognize this act revealed the fundamental divergence in objectives, but in the summer of 1941, many members of the battalions still believed that effective participation in the campaign could alter German calculations. Logistical and organizational details reflected these differing intentions. The Nachtigall battalion was equipped primarily with German weapons, Karabiner 98K rifles, a limited number of MG-34 machine guns, and standard Wehrmacht field gear. Uniforms were German, with small insignia to mark Ukrainian identity. Command structures were hybrid. German officers provided strategic supervision, while Ukrainian officers managed internal discipline and daily operations. The Roland battalion, stationed initially in Romania, received less comprehensive equipment, reflecting its planned use for rear area duties rather than frontline combat. Its structure was closer to a company than a battalion in terms of firepower, emphasizing mobility and auxiliary tasks. Supply lines for these units were integrated into Wehrmacht logistics. Rations, ammunition, and medical support were provided through German channels, reinforcing their dependent status. This dependency highlighted a vulnerability. Without German recognition, the battalions could not sustain independent operations. For nationalist leaders, this reality was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave them access to modern weapons and training. On the other, it tied their existence entirely to German military objectives, undermining any claim of autonomy. Propaganda was a central element of the strategic planning for both the Germans and the Ukrainians. German leaflets and broadcasts emphasized the liberation of Ukraine from Bolshevik tyranny, seeking to portray the Wehrmacht as a force of order and renewal. The presence of Ukrainian battalions in German ranks was intended to reinforce this narrative. Their visibility in uniform was supposed to convince civilians that Ukrainians themselves were aligned with Germany. At the same time, OUN activists used the battalion's presence to argue that armed Ukrainian units were already forming the core of a future national army. This dual propaganda campaign created contradictory expectations among the population. Some hoped for genuine independence, while others quickly realized that German policies of requisitioning, arrests, and anti-Jewish violence revealed occupation rather than liberation. Miscalculations on both sides became evident within weeks. For the Germans, the assumption that Ukrainian nationalists would be content to serve indefinitely without political concessions underestimated the depth of their independence aspirations. For the Ukrainians, the belief that Berlin might tolerate a sovereign Ukrainian state misread the rigid ideological position of the Nazi regime. Hitler's directives in July 1941 explicitly forbade recognition of any national movements in the occupied Soviet territories. This made the fate of the Nachtigall and Roland battalions precarious. They continued to function operationally through the summer, but without any prospect of transforming into the nucleus of a Ukrainian army. By late July 1941, tensions had deepened. The arrest of Bandera and Stetsko by the Germans demonstrated Berlin's determination to suppress nationalist political initiatives. The Abwehr, which had initially sponsored the battalions, lost influence as the SS and civil administration expanded their control over occupied Ukraine. The role of Nachtigall and Roland became more limited, confined to auxiliary tasks rather than independent missions. Their original strategic purpose, to combine local knowledge with German military planning, was overshadowed by the larger reality of occupation policy. In this sense, the planning phase revealed the core contradiction of the Ukrainian battalions. They were created with tactical utility in mind, but became entangled in strategic disputes far beyond their size or capacity. For Germany, they were small auxiliary units within a campaign involving millions of soldiers. For the Ukrainian nationalists, They symbolize the possibility of armed statehood. This fundamental mismatch of expectations shaped the subsequent trajectory of both battalions as the campaign advanced deeper into Soviet territory. The first engagements involving the Nachtigall and Roland battalions unfolded against the backdrop of the Wehrmacht's rapid drive into western Ukraine during the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. The German advance into Galicia and Volhynia was swift. Entire Soviet formations collapsed under the combined pressure of German armored spearheads, concentrated air attacks, and encirclement tactics. In this environment, the battalions operated as auxiliaries, assigned tasks that ranged from reconnaissance and communications to maintaining security in newly captured areas. Their actions, while small in scale compared to the sweeping movements of the front, carried significant symbolic and political weight. Nachtigall entered combat alongside the 1st Mountain Division, moving through the Carpathian foothills and into the plains of Galicia. The battalion's early missions included securing villages, checking for retreating Red Army soldiers, and establishing order behind the front lines. Skirmishes occurred with isolated Soviet detachments and retreating border guard units, but most resistance in the first days was sporadic. Reports indicate that Nachtigall participated in patrols near Zolochiv and Ternopil, conducting searches for stragglers and collecting intelligence on Soviet defensive positions. Their role was not to lead assaults, but to support the German advance by stabilizing rear sectors. The entry of Nachtigall into Lviv on June 30, 1941, marked its most visible moment in the early campaign. Together with elements of the Wehrmacht, the battalion marched into the city, which had already suffered days of aerial bombardment and the retreat of Soviet forces. The withdrawal of the Red Army had been accompanied by mass executions in NKVD prisons, with thousands of detainees, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and others, killed before the Soviets abandoned the city. When German forces in Nachtigall arrived, the discovery of the bodies created a volatile atmosphere. German propaganda immediately publicized these atrocities as evidence of Bolshevik crimes, and Ukrainian nationalists used the event to rally support for independence. The juxtaposition of the NKVD prison massacres and the Ukrainian nationalist proclamation of statehood created a powerful, though unstable, moment. The same day, Yaroslav Stetsko, a leading OUNB activist, proclaimed the active renewal of Ukrainian statehood from Lviv. While this was a political action, rather than a direct military task of the Nachtigall Battalion, the unit's presence gave it a martial and symbolic frame. Members of the battalion were seen as the armed arm of the nationalist cause, even though the declaration itself had not been approved by Berlin. The proclamation was greeted by segments of the population with enthusiasm, but German authorities quickly signaled their disapproval. For the rank-and-file soldiers of Nachtigall, the day combined triumph with uncertainty. Their presence in Lviv was celebrated locally, but placed them in direct tension with their German sponsors. Roland's trajectory during these early weeks was different. Deployed from Romania into Bukovina and northern Bessarabia, the battalion did not participate in dramatic urban entries or proclamations. Its assignments included guarding bridges, securing supply depots, and patrolling rural areas to prevent sabotage. Though these tasks lacked visibility, they were critical to sustaining the Wehrmacht's rapid movement. In engagements with retreating Red Army units, Roland suffered its first casualties. Reports from July 1941 mention ambushes by Soviet irregulars which tested the cohesion of the battalion. Despite its auxiliary status, Roland operated in areas where the front was fluid, exposing its members to unexpected clashes. Civilian reactions to the presence of these units varied. In western Ukraine, many greeted them with a mixture of relief and hope, seeing them as potential symbols of a Ukrainian military force. Nationalist activists distributed leaflets emphasizing that Ukrainian soldiers were already participating in the liberation of their homeland. At the same time, violence against Jews escalated in Lviv and other cities. The pogroms of late June and early July 1941, while primarily instigated by German authorities and carried out by local militias, coincided with the presence of Nachtigall. This overlap became the basis for later allegations that the battalion had taken part in the violence. Contemporary German and Ukrainian records, however, suggest that the massacres were organized by the Einsatzgruppen with assistance from local auxiliary police rather than directly from the battalion. Nevertheless, the political and moral burden of this association would haunt the historical memory of Nachtigall long after the war. Militarily, the first month of operations revealed both the utility and the limitations of these battalions. Their small size, each numbering fewer than 400 men, meant they could not decisively influence the course of battles involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Yet their knowledge of the local terrain and language made them valuable in reconnaissance and intelligence. Nachtigall patrols were credited with locating hidden Soviet ammunition dumps and partisan groups. Roland detachments reported on Soviet troop movements in Bukovina, information that contributed to the larger encirclement battles being waged by Army Group South. Unexpected outcomes also shaped their early history. The rapid pace of the German advance created logistical difficulties. Supply lines stretched thin, leaving the battalions short on food and medical support. In some cases, soldiers resorted to requisitioning supplies from local villages, deepening tensions with civilians. Discipline issues arose as expectations diverged between nationalist hopes and German control. Some members of Nachtigall openly questioned whether they were truly fighting for Ukraine's independence or simply serving German objectives. These doubts foreshadowed the growing rift between the nationalist movement and Berlin, which would only widen in the following months. By mid-July 1941, both battalions had advanced deeper into Soviet territory. Nachtigall moved eastward toward Vinnytsia, while Roland operated in Podolia and southern Ukraine. Their activities remained focused on securing communication lines, pursuing retreating Soviet units, and maintaining order in occupied areas. The Red Army's retreat was chaotic, but Soviet resistance was stiffening. Scattered counterattacks and the emergence of irregular partisan groups added new challenges. The first engagements demonstrated that while these Ukrainian battalions could provide localized support, they were ultimately small auxiliaries in a conflict of unprecedented scale. The early optimism of their formation was already tempered by the reality of occupation policies, German distrust, and the harsh conditions of war on the Eastern Front. As the campaign in Ukraine expanded in July and August 1941, the Nachtigall and Roland battalions were drawn into a widening crisis that reflected both the scale of the German-Soviet war and the increasingly contradictory position of Ukrainian nationalists. What began as an initial phase of rapid advances soon turned into a more complex struggle marked by mounting casualties, logistical strain, and growing political tensions. For the two battalions, this period was defined less by decisive battles and more by the challenges of maintaining cohesion, fulfilling their assigned tasks, and navigating their precarious status between German authority and Ukrainian aspirations. The escalation of conflict on the southern front placed the battalions under constant pressure. Army Group South was tasked with capturing Kiev, the Dnieper crossings, and ultimately the industrial Donbas region. This involved some of the largest encirclement operations of the war. The Battle of Uman in late July 1941 resulted in the capture of over 100,000 Soviet troops, while preparations for the larger encirclement of Kiev were already underway. Within this vast theater, the battalion's assignments were relatively small in scope, but demanding in execution. Nachtigall advanced with the 1st Mountain Division into Podolia and Vinnytsia regions, conducting patrols, searching for isolated Soviet detachments, and attempting to secure key infrastructure. Roland, operating further south, was deployed to guard transportation routes critical to supplying the German advance. The conditions they faced were increasingly harsh. Summer heat, inadequate rations, and overextended medical services created strains. German logistics, already stretched to support massive armored thrusts, provided limited supplies to auxiliary units. Soldiers in both battalions often had to forage for food or rely on requisitioning from local villagers, a practice that bred resentment among civilians. Disease also spread quickly in the field, Cases of dysentery and typhus were reported, reducing operational strength. These hardships tested morale. Many recruits had joined with the expectation of fighting for Ukrainian independence, yet by midsummer they were performing tasks of occupation and supply security that seemed far removed from nationalist goals. Politically, the crisis deepened when Berlin moved decisively against Ukrainian independence efforts. Following the proclamation of statehood in Lviv, German authorities arrested Bandera and Stetsko in early July 1941, placing them under house arrest and later in concentration camps. This action sent a clear signal to Ukrainian nationalists: Germany would not tolerate independent political initiatives. Within the battalions, this news spread rapidly, causing disillusionment. Some soldiers began questioning their continued service under German command. However, desertion was difficult, as the units were tightly supervised by the Abwehr and Wehrmacht. The ideological rift between German objectives and Ukrainian aspirations widened, even as the battalions remained operational. Tensions also emerged within the German command structure. The Abwehr had sponsored Nachtigall and Roland, but as the SS and German civil administration expanded their influence in occupied Ukraine, they grew suspicious of the nationalist units. Reports circulated that members of the battalions were spreading propaganda about Ukrainian independence, undermining German authority. Complaints from Wehrmacht officers noted that some soldiers appeared more interested in nationalist symbols and slogans than in carrying out their assigned duties. The combination of ideological mistrust and political conflict placed the future of the battalions in jeopardy. The situation on the ground further complicated matters. As the Red Army regrouped, partisan activity began to increase behind German lines. In rural areas of Volhynia, Podelia, and Bukovina, small bands of Soviet irregulars attacked supply convoys, ambushed patrols, and destroyed infrastructure. Both Nachtigall and Roland were assigned to counter these threats. Skirmishes with partisans were often brutal and confused, involving small-scale firefights in forests and villages. For the Ukrainian soldiers, fighting against partisans, many of whom were themselves local peasants, highlighted the complexity of the war. Some viewed these engagements as necessary to secure territory. Others saw them as evidence that they were being used to suppress their own population in German interests. Casualties, though limited compared to the frontline divisions, mounted steadily. By August 1941, Nachtigall had suffered several dozen killed and wounded in patrols and skirmishes, while Roland lost men in ambushes and accidents during rear area security operations. These numbers were small relative to the massive Soviet losses in the hundreds of thousands, but within battalions of only a few hundred men, each loss was significant. Replacement personnel were scarce, as recruitment of new volunteers was tightly controlled by the Germans. This further eroded morale and operational effectiveness. Internationally, the role of the battalions also began to attract scrutiny. Reports from Soviet sources accused them of collaborating with the occupiers in anti-partisan actions and in violence against civilians. German propaganda, on the other hand, continued to highlight their existence as proof of local support for the liberation of Ukraine. This contradictory portrayal reflected the ambiguous nature of their role. Auxiliaries bound to German command, but associated, rightly or wrongly, with nationalist ambitions and the darker aspects of occupation. By the end of August 1941, the crisis of identity and purpose had reached a peak. Both battalions remained in the field, carrying out assignments under Abwehr supervision, yet their political future was uncertain. Within weeks, the German command would begin to consider disbanding them, fearing their nationalist orientation posed more of a risk than a benefit. For the men in Nachtigall and Roland, the summer of 1941 thus represented not only their first real test in war, but also the moment when the contradictions of their position became fully apparent. The clash between their aspirations and German occupation policy would shape their trajectory as the campaign entered its next stage. By September 1941, the German advance into Ukraine had reached its height, culminating in the encirclement battles that destroyed large Soviet formations and opened the way toward the Dnieper. Within this vast offensive, the Nachtigall and Roland battalions continued to operate, but their roles and significance were increasingly overshadowed by larger developments. For Army Group South, the central objective was the encirclement of Kiev, which became one of the largest battles of the entire war. For the Ukrainian battalions, this period represented the peak of their activity, but also the beginning of their decline as independent formations. The encirclement of Kiev in September 1941 involved more than 500,000 Soviet troops, with the Red Army's southwestern front attempting to hold the city against converging German forces. The Wehrmacht's 1st Panzer Group under Ewald von Kleist and 2nd Panzer Group under Heinz Guderian closed the trap, while infantry divisions tightened the encirclement. Amid this massive operation, Nachtigall was attached to units securing communication lines and assisting in patrols to prevent Soviet breakouts. Their participation was small compared to the scale of the fighting, but it placed them directly in areas of heavy movement of troops and refugees. They guarded bridges, secured villages, and participated in clearing operations against Soviet soldiers attempting to evade capture. Reports suggest that members of the battalion also assisted German officers in interrogating prisoners due to their language skills. Roland, operating further south, was deployed in Podylia and eventually into central Ukraine. Its tasks continued to involve guarding roads and supply depots, as well as escorting columns of prisoners. In this period, tens of thousands of Soviet POWs were taken daily, overwhelming German logistical capacity. Roland detachments were used to secure prisoner marches and prevent escapes. Conditions in these prisoner columns were catastrophic, with shortages of food and water leading to mass deaths. While Roland itself did not determine policy, its auxiliary role in guarding POW movements tied it to one of the defining humanitarian disasters of the early occupation. Civilian populations also bore the brunt of the occupation during this phase. As German forces consolidated their control, requisitioning of food and housing intensified. For many Ukrainians, the initial hopes of liberation were replaced by the harsh reality of occupation. German authorities introduced strict controls, forced labor policies, and widespread arrests. The presence of the Ukrainian battalions in German uniform complicated perceptions. Some civilians saw them as national forces and expected protection. Others viewed them as collaborators implementing German orders. The contrast between nationalist rhetoric and actual duties in occupation zones created tension within the units themselves. Soldiers often faced demands from villagers to act independently, while German officers insisted on strict obedience. The peak of the campaign also revealed the limits of German tolerance for nationalist symbols. Members of Nachtigall continued to display Ukrainian insignia and to promote the idea that they were the nucleus of a future national army. German commanders grew increasingly uneasy with these actions. By autumn, reports reached higher authorities that the battalions were fostering nationalist sentiment in occupied areas. Combined with the political conflict caused by the July proclamation of independence in Lviv, this led Berlin to reassess the utility of the formations. Although they remained under Abwehr control, their existence was increasingly seen as politically dangerous. Militarily, the battalions were stretched thin. Nachtigall, with fewer than 300 men by September, struggled to maintain effective operations. Casualties, illness, and desertions reduced its numbers. Roland faced similar challenges, losing men to disease and exhaustion. Their equipment, never abundant, was wearing down from constant marches and inadequate maintenance. Ammunition resupply was dependent on German channels, which prioritized frontline divisions. In some cases, soldiers carried only minimal supplies of cartridges, limiting their ability to engage in extended firefights. Despite these limitations, both units continued to carry out German orders. Nachtigall detachments were reported operating east of Vinnytsia, conducting anti-partisan sweeps in villages suspected of harboring Soviet stragglers. Roland guarded supply routes feeding the German drive toward the lower Dnieper. Their presence ensured that local uprisings or sabotage did not disrupt the logistical flow. Yet the psychological strain grew. Many Ukrainian soldiers had expected to fight directly against the Red Army in decisive battles, but instead they were tasked primarily with policing roles. This disillusionment eroded morale and strengthened doubts about whether Germany would ever support Ukrainian independence. Meanwhile, the international situation began to shift. Reports of German occupation policies and atrocities filtered westward, reaching Allied governments and exile organizations. The Soviet Union, in its propaganda, denounced both battalions as instruments of German imperialism, accusing them of participating in massacres and repression. These claims were exaggerated but found resonance in the climate of total war. Within the nationalist movement itself, debates emerged about whether collaboration with Germany had been a strategic mistake. Leaders in exile questioned the wisdom of placing Ukrainian hopes on Berlin, while those on the ground faced the daily reality of serving an occupier that denied their political aspirations. By the end of 1941, the initial promise that Nachtigall and Roland represented for Ukrainian nationalists had faded. They had reached their operational peak during the summer advance, but their limited size, auxiliary status, and political constraints prevented them from becoming the foundation of a Ukrainian army. German mistrust, combined with the refusal to recognize Ukrainian independence, set the stage for the eventual disbandment of the battalions. Their peak period, marked by participation in encirclement battles, rear area security, and occupation duties, thus also represented the moment when the contradictions of their existence were most visible. Militarily useful in narrow roles, politically unacceptable to both Berlin and the nationalist leadership. By late autumn 1941, the war on the Eastern Front had entered a new phase. The initial momentum of Operation Barbarossa slowed as Soviet resistance stiffened, and German forces faced stretched supply lines, worsening weather, and growing partisan activity. For the Nachtigall and Roland battalions, this period was characterized not by spectacular offensives, but by adaptation to changing conditions, shifting roles, and the growing contradictions between their aspirations and the reality of German occupation policy. Their tasks became increasingly focused on security and policing functions, while their nationalist agenda drifted further from German tolerance. The expansion of partisan warfare in Ukraine placed new demands on auxiliary formations. After the destruction of Soviet armies in the summer encirclements, thousands of Red Army soldiers who escaped captivity regrouped in forests and rural areas. By October 1941, small partisan detachments were operating across Volhynia, Policia, and Podylia. Their actions included ambushing supply convoys, derailing trains, and attacking isolated garrisons. German divisions concentrated on pushing toward the Dnieper and Moscow, leaving rear areas vulnerable. In this environment, Nachtigall and Roland were increasingly tasked with anti-partisan operations. These missions involved patrolling villages, conducting sweeps through wooded areas, and assisting German security forces in identifying suspected partisans or their supporters. For the Ukrainian soldiers, these assignments were fraught with complexity. Many partisans were local peasants or former Red Army soldiers familiar to the population. Fighting them often meant engaging people from the same communities that nationalists claimed to represent. This created moral and political tension. Some members viewed anti-partisan operations as legitimate, believing that partisan activity endangered Ukrainian civilians by provoking German reprisals. Others saw it as evidence that they were being used against their own people in the service of occupation. The psychological toll grew as reports of reprisals mounted. Entire villages were punished for alleged partisan support, with houses burned and inhabitants executed. Although the battalions were not the primary executors of these reprisals, these were typically carried out by Wehrmacht security units, or SS detachments. Their participation in sweeps linked them to the machinery of occupation violence. Logistical adaptation also became necessary. The onset of autumn rains and the approach of winter transformed the operational landscape. Roads turned into mud, slowing movement and disrupting supply lines. German logistics, already strained by the distances involved, struggled to provide adequate rations and equipment to frontline and auxiliary units alike. For the small battalions, shortages of clothing, boots, and food became acute. Soldiers improvised by requisitioning from local populations, further straining relations with civilians. Some relied on captured Soviet supplies or on local nationalist networks for assistance. Illness spread rapidly, with cases of frostbite and disease reducing their numbers even before winter fully set in. Organizationally, both battalions faced increasing uncertainty. Reports from German commanders indicated dissatisfaction with their performance. While acknowledging their usefulness in reconnaissance and local security, German officers noted their nationalist propaganda activities and the persistence of independence rhetoric among members. The Abwehr, which had originally sponsored the units, found itself losing influence as the SS and Reich Commissariat for Ukraine expanded authority in occupied territories. These rival structures were openly hostile to the idea of Ukrainian autonomy and viewed the battalions as politically unreliable. The result was growing pressure to dissolve or reorganize them into formations stripped of nationalist identity. Within the nationalist movement, disillusionment deepened. News of Bandera's and Stetsko's arrests circulated widely, confirming that Berlin had no intention of recognizing the Lviv proclamation of independence. OUN activists debated how to proceed. Some argued for continued tactical cooperation with Germany, hoping that success against the Soviets might eventually create opportunities. Others began to advocate for breaking away entirely and preparing for an armed struggle against both occupiers. The experience of Nachtigall and Roland in the field provided a case study. While they had gained training and experience, their lack of autonomy demonstrated the limits of collaboration. These debates foreshadowed the eventual turn toward the creation of independent nationalist armed groups, which would later evolve into the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA. The morale of the battalions fluctuated accordingly. Some soldiers remained committed, convinced that participation under German command was a necessary step in building a military cadre for the future. Others grew disillusioned, questioning the purpose of their service when German authorities consistently rejected nationalist aspirations. Desertion, though limited, occurred in isolated cases, with individuals attempting to join underground nationalist cells or return to civilian life. Discipline problems were reported by German supervisors, reinforcing the perception of the units as unreliable. Despite these challenges, the battalions continued to function. Nachtigall detachments were deployed east of Vinnytsia and toward the Dnieper, where they carried out reconnaissance and patrol duties in support of the encirclement of Kiev and subsequent operations. Roland remained active in southern Ukraine, attached to units operating in Podylia and Bukovina, securing communication lines and logistical hubs. In both cases, their missions were essential to the Wehrmacht's ability to maintain momentum, even if their direct impact on major battles was limited. By November 1941, however, the writing was on the wall. German commanders increasingly questioned the long-term viability of maintaining politically suspect nationalist units. The immediate military utility of the battalions could not outweigh the potential political risk they posed. Plans were drafted to withdraw them from frontline duties and reorganize them into labor or police units under stricter German control. This marked the beginning of the end for Nachtigall and Roland as distinct formations. Thus, the period of late 1941 represented both adaptation and transition. The battalions had gained combat experience and established a visible presence, but their nationalist ambitions had been thwarted. German mistrust, coupled with the harsh realities of occupation and partisan warfare, forced them into roles that alienated both their own members and the civilian populations they sought to represent. The contradictions that had defined their creation were now driving their dissolution, setting the stage for the decisive changes that would follow in 1942. The turning point for the Nachtigall and Roland battalions came in late 1941 and early 1942, when German authorities decided that the risks of maintaining politically motivated Ukrainian units outweighed their military usefulness. After months of service in reconnaissance, security, and anti-partisan duties, both battalions were recalled from the front and stripped of their independent character. This process reflected both the changing military situation and the increasingly uncompromising stance of the Nazi regime toward nationalist movements in occupied Eastern Europe. The decision to reorganize the battalions was made against the backdrop of the Wehrmacht's first major setbacks. The rapid summer advances had culminated in the capture of Kiev in September, and deep thrusts into Soviet territory. But by December 1941, the German offensive had stalled at the gates of Moscow. The Red Army launched counteroffensives that pushed German forces back, inflicting heavy losses. In Ukraine, partisan activity expanded, and the occupation became more unstable. For German commanders, auxiliary units such as Nachtigall and Roland were useful in specific contexts, but politically problematic. Reports from both the Wehrmacht and the SS emphasized that members of the battalions continued to propagate Ukrainian nationalist slogans and that some had direct ties to OUN underground structures. This was seen as unacceptable in a system that demanded absolute loyalty to German objectives. By autumn 1941, German distrust had reached the point where the battalion's existence was no longer tolerated in their original form. Orders were issued to withdraw them from frontline and rear area duties. The Nachtigall battalion was recalled from Vinnytsia in October and sent back to Krakow for reorganization. Roland, operating in southern Ukraine, was also withdrawn by the end of November. Officially, these withdrawals were justified on the grounds of restructuring and consolidation of auxiliary forces. In reality, they reflected Berlin's decision to eliminate nationalist-controlled formations. The transformation took place in early 1942. Both battalions were merged into a new formation known as Schutzmannschaft Battalion 201, organized under direct German police supervision. This new unit numbered around 650 men, composed largely of former Nachtigall and Roland soldiers. Command was nominally given to Yevhen Pobihushchi, but real authority rested with German officers. The battalion was redeployed to Belarus, where it carried out security operations, anti-partisan sweeps, and rear area policing. Its Ukrainian identity was reduced to a nominal feature, as the unit was subordinated to the Ordnungspolizei structure. For many soldiers, this reorganization marked a decisive break with their earlier hopes. When they had joined Nachtigall or Roland, they believed they were laying the foundations of a Ukrainian national army. Instead, they found themselves absorbed into a German-controlled police battalion used primarily to suppress partisan resistance in Belarus. The sense of betrayal was acute. Some accepted the new role, viewing continued service as a way to gain military experience and preserve discipline. Others became increasingly disillusioned, leading to desertions and clandestine contacts with underground nationalist networks. The dissolution of the original battalions also had wider political repercussions. Within the OUNB faction, the arrest of Bandera and Stetsko, combined with the disbandment of Nachtigall, convinced many activists that Germany would never support Ukrainian independence. This realization accelerated preparations for the creation of independent armed formations. The experiences of Nachtigall and Roland provided valuable lessons. German sponsorship offered training and weapons, but no autonomy, while nationalist aspirations were suppressed the moment they clashed with Nazi objectives. By late 1942, these lessons directly influenced the formation of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, which sought to avoid dependence on foreign powers and to fight for independence against both Germans and Soviets. In German records, the battalions were remembered as short-lived auxiliaries. Reports noted their effectiveness in reconnaissance and local security tasks, but emphasized their political unreliability. Accusations of nationalist propaganda and disobedience circulated widely, reinforcing the decision to dissolve them. Soviet sources, meanwhile, portrayed them as collaborators and accused them of involvement in atrocities, particularly in Lviv in 1941. These allegations became central to Soviet post-war propaganda, shaping public memory of the battalions as instruments of German occupation rather than nationalist experiments. The individuals who had served in Nachtigall and Roland carried their experiences into the broader currents of the war. Roman Shukevich, former commander of Nachtigall, later became the commander of the UPA, leading the nationalist armed struggle from 1943 until his death in 1950. Many rank-and-file members of both battalions joined nationalist underground organizations or partisan units after their service in Schutzmannschaft 201 ended. Others remained in German service, either out of necessity or conviction. Their divergent paths reflected the fractured choices available to Ukrainians under occupation: collaboration, resistance, or survival in conditions dictated by two totalitarian powers. Thus, the turning point of 1941-1942 closed the brief chapter of Nachtigall and Roland as distinct battalions. Their dissolution underscored the fundamental contradiction between nationalist aspirations and German occupation policy. For the Wehrmacht and the SS, auxiliaries could be tolerated only as long as they remained obedient tools. For Ukrainian nationalists, the battalions demonstrated that collaboration could not achieve independence. This realization would shape the course of the nationalist movement for the remainder of the war, as the focus shifted from cooperation with Germany to the pursuit of armed struggle on their own terms. The immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the Nachtigall and Roland battalions in early 1942 highlighted the contradictions that had defined their existence since their creation. Officially, the battalions ceased to operate as autonomous entities and were absorbed into the newly established Schutzmannschaft Battalion 201. This reorganization was presented by German authorities as a measure of efficiency, consolidating auxiliary forces under stricter control. In reality, it marked the end of any Ukrainian-led military formation under German sponsorship. For the men who had volunteered in 1941, the transition represented both a loss of autonomy and a profound political disappointment. Schutzmannschaft Battalion 201 was stationed in Belarus, where it carried out anti-partisan operations throughout 1942. Composed of around 650 men, most of them veterans of Nachtigall and Roland, the unit operated under the command of Yevhen Pobihushi, but was supervised by German Ordnungspolizei officers. Its missions included patrolling rural areas, searching villages for suspected partisans, and guarding transport routes. These duties placed the battalion in the heart of the brutal German campaign against irregular resistance, which often involved collective punishments, forced evacuations, and destruction of settlements. While not the primary executors of the mass atrocities carried out by the SS and police, Battalion 201 was part of the occupation apparatus, and its operations became intertwined with the repression of local populations. The conditions in Belarus were difficult. Dense forests, poor infrastructure, and growing partisan strength made operations arduous and dangerous. Partisan units, often composed of escaped Red Army soldiers and supported by local civilians, conducted ambushes, sabotage, and attacks on German garrisons. Battalion 201 suffered casualties in these operations, including killed and wounded during skirmishes. The Germans demanded ruthless measures, expecting auxiliaries to enforce order with uncompromising severity. For many of the Ukrainian soldiers, this role clashed with the nationalist ideals that had motivated them in 1941. Instead of advancing the cause of independence, they were now tied to German counterinsurgency efforts in a foreign land. Morale deteriorated steadily during 1942. Reports from both German and Ukrainian sources indicate growing dissatisfaction within the ranks. Soldiers complained about inadequate supplies, harsh conditions, and the lack of political purpose in their service. Disillusionment deepened when it became clear that Germany would not reconsider its policy toward Ukrainian statehood. The nationalist underground within Ukraine, reorganizing after the collapse of the battalions, actively spread propaganda urging soldiers to abandon German service and join independent resistance efforts. Secret contacts were established between OUN activists and members of Battalion 201, preparing the ground for mass desertions. The breaking point came in late 1942. As the Wehrmacht suffered defeats at Stalingrad and Soviet partisans grew stronger in Belarus, the cohesion of Battalion 201 collapsed. In December 1942, the unit was officially disbanded. Most of its Ukrainian members refused to renew their contracts with the Germans. Some returned home to western Ukraine, while others joined underground nationalist forces that were beginning to organize armed resistance. The experience gained in the battalions, training, discipline, and combat skills proved invaluable in the formation of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, which emerged as a significant force in 1943. The dissolution of Battalion 201 thus marked both the end of one phase of nationalist military collaboration with Germany and the beginning of another phase of independent armed struggle. The German reaction to this development was one of frustration and mistrust. Reports described the Ukrainian soldiers as politically unreliable, more concerned with their nationalist agenda than with serving German interests. The Abwehr, which had originally sponsored the units, had by this time lost influence to the SS and civil administration, which were openly hostile to nationalist ambitions. The failure of Nachtigall and Roland confirmed their suspicions. Auxiliary formations built on nationalist ideology could not be controlled indefinitely. After 1942, German authorities avoided granting similar autonomy to Ukrainian units, relying instead on police battalions, conscripted auxiliaries, and later the 14th Waffen-SS Division Galician, which was organized under much stricter German oversight. For the Ukrainian nationalist movement, however, the lessons were clear. Cooperation with Germany had not led to independence. Instead, it had resulted in betrayal, arrests of leaders, and the forced assimilation of their battalions into German-controlled structures. The experience hardened attitudes within the OUN, particularly the Bandera faction, which concluded that only independent military organization could secure Ukrainian statehood. The veterans of Nachtigall and Roland played a central role in this transition. Figures such as Roman Shukhevich carried forward their military experience into the leadership of the UPA, shaping its tactics and organizational structure. The dissolution also had immediate consequences for local populations. In Belarus, where Battalion 201 had operated, its departure left German security forces overstretched. Reprisals against civilians intensified as German units sought to compensate for the loss of auxiliary manpower. In Ukraine, the return of veterans fueled the growth of underground nationalist networks, accelerating preparations for armed resistance. The shift of experienced fighters from German service into the nationalist underground marked a turning point in the balance of power within occupied Ukraine. Thus, the withdrawal and eventual disbandment of the Nachtigall and Roland formations represented both an end and a beginning. For the Germans, it was the conclusion of a failed experiment in harnessing nationalist aspirations for military utility. For the Ukrainians, it was the start of a new phase in which the lessons of collaboration were transformed into a doctrine of independent struggle. The immediate consequences included disillusionment, desertion, and political rupture. But the long-term impact was the creation of a more determined, self-reliant nationalist resistance movement that would play a significant role in the later years of the war. The legacy of the Nachtigall and Roland battalions remained contested long after their dissolution. Their existence in 1941-1942 was brief, yet the political and historical debates surrounding them extended for decades, shaped by the broader struggle over the memory of the Second World War and the Ukrainian nationalist movement. To understand their significance, it is necessary to examine not only their immediate role in the German-Soviet War, but also how they were interpreted by post-war governments, scholars, and nationalist communities. For Nazi Germany, the battalions were remembered primarily as a failed experiment. Reports compiled in 1942 described them as militarily useful in limited roles, but politically unreliable. Their members had demonstrated discipline in patrols, reconnaissance, and anti-partisan operations, yet their insistence on displaying Ukrainian symbols and promoting nationalist slogans made them unacceptable to occupation authorities. After their absorption into Schutzmannschaft Battalion 201 and subsequent disbandment, German policy shifted decisively toward avoiding independent nationalist formations. Later attempts to raise Ukrainian units, such as the Waffen-SS Division Galician in 1943, were carefully structured to ensure complete German control. In this sense, the short history of Nachtigall and Roland influenced subsequent occupation policies, reinforcing the regime's hostility toward nationalist autonomy. For the Soviet Union, the battalions became a cornerstone of propaganda. From the early 1940s, Soviet publications accused Nachtigall and Roland of direct involvement in atrocities, particularly in the pogroms and mass killings in Lviv in late June and early July 1941. Soviet narratives portrayed the battalions as evidence of nationalist collaboration with fascism, using them to delegitimize the entire Ukrainian independence movement. This portrayal was repeated in official histories, political trials, and propaganda campaigns during and after the war. In the post-war decades, Soviet authorities continued to highlight the battalions as proof that Ukrainian nationalism was inseparable from fascism and betrayal, a message aimed at undermining support for nationalist underground movements that continued fighting into the 1950s. Western scholarship presented a more complex picture. Researchers in the decades after the war investigated the structure, deployment, and activities of the battalions, often highlighting the ambiguity of their position. Studies noted that while the units had been formed under German sponsorship and carried out security operations, their nationalist members had hoped to use the war as a platform for independence. Some historians emphasized their limited military role and the fact that they were disbanded once their political unreliability became apparent. Others examined accusations of involvement in atrocities, concluding that while Einsatzgruppen and local militias were primarily responsible for organized pogroms, the battalion's presence in Lviv at the time made them part of the broader context of violence. The debate over their culpability became one of the most contentious aspects of their legacy. Within the Ukrainian nationalist diaspora, the battalions were remembered as a first attempt to establish an armed national force during the Second World War. Veterans and supporters emphasized the discipline, training, and military experience gained, which later contributed to the formation of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA. Figures such as Roman Shukhevych became central to this narrative, remembered as leaders who had used their experience in Nachtigall to organize a more independent resistance movement. In this perspective, the battalion symbolized both the hope of 1941 and the betrayal by Germany that forced Ukrainians to chart their own path. The emphasis was not on their service under German command, but on the lessons that service provided for future struggles. The long-term consequences of the battalion's history were thus dual. On the one hand, they became tools of Soviet propaganda, portrayed as collaborators and war criminals, their memory invoked to discredit Ukrainian nationalism. On the other hand, they became symbols within nationalist memory of the dangers of relying on foreign powers and the necessity of independent armed struggle. The disbandment of the battalions and the subsequent participation of many veterans in the UPA ensured that their legacy fed directly into the armed conflict that raged in Ukraine from 1943 onward, when nationalist partisans fought simultaneously against German occupiers, Soviet forces, and later the Polish underground. Today, historical debates about Nachtigall and Roland continue. Scholars emphasize the importance of separating verified facts from propaganda claims. The battalions numbered only several hundred men, operated under Abwehr supervision for a few months, and were ultimately dissolved for political reasons. Yet their symbolic weight far exceeded their military size. Their presence at key moments, the entry into Lviv in June 1941, the proclamation of independence, and the early months of German occupation, ensured that they would remain part of historical memory. The accusations of their involvement in atrocities, while still disputed among researchers, continue to shape public perceptions and political debates. In the broader history of the Second World War, the battalions highlight the dilemmas faced by small nations caught between two totalitarian powers. Ukrainian nationalists sought to exploit the German-Soviet War to achieve independence, but their reliance on Germany in 1941 quickly revealed the impossibility of aligning nationalist goals with Nazi occupation policy. The result was a short-lived collaboration that ended in disappointment and repression, but also provided experience that later fed into independent resistance movements. The story of Nachtigall and Roland thus stands as both a cautionary episode and a formative chapter. It illustrates how nationalist movements attempted to navigate the shifting alliances of the war, how occupation powers manipulated local aspirations, and how memory of these events became a battlefield in its own right. Their legacy continues to be debated not only by historians, but also in public discourse, reflecting the unresolved complexities of Ukraine's 20th century history.